Masechas Shabbos Daf. The Masechta begins by defining for us the first of the malachas which we will be learning, which is the malacha which is called hotzah, commonly called carrying. It's not really about carrying, it's about transferring an object from one domain to another domain. Now, every malacha which we will be learning throughout Masechta Shabbos, the primary work is to identify what the parameters of defining the malacha are. So the daf begins with a mishnah, which is quite lengthy. It defines for us the parameters of hotzah, carrying, by way of 8 different permutations of how the malacha, the act, might actually be carried out. These 8 cases will then be challenged in the Gemara. The Gemara will quote that there is another place in Shas that lists only 4. The Gemara is going to spend the majority of the daf trying to figure out why here we list 8 and over there we list 4. The Gemara will try 2 different options, and that'll pretty much take us to the end of the daf. So let's begin. So as with every malacha, what we need to do is define what exactly the parameters of carrying are. So when we define a malacha, there's a few things we need to do. First of all, we have to figure out what is the av malacha. What is the primary category of this malacha? What factors define it? Often we'll have to also define the subcategories. These are called the toldas. They are also d'oraisa, they are also biblical violations. It's important to understand that. And av and tolda are both biblical, they're both also d'oraisa. But we have to define the parameters of the tolda. And then often we'll also have to define when a person violates this malacha on a rabbinical level, where it's asur midrabanan. Now it's important to learn the code words over here. Something which is d'oraisa, the Gemara calls it chayev. That means that if somebody violates it, he is chayev a korban if he does it b'shogeg. He has to bring a korban chatos. And if he does it on purpose, he's chayev skila. So the term chayev always means d'oraisa. The term pater means he's not obligated in a korban or a skila, but it's still usually forbidden midrabanan. These are terms which we will see throughout the Masechta. Now, as far as Shabbos itself, so the Mishnah begins by defining it for us. We'll go straight to how it defines, and then we'll see the Mishnah's language. It defines us as follows. There are 3 steps in every transferring of an object from one domain to another domain. Let's get used to using the terms rishus. Rishus is a domain. There is rishus hayachid and rishus harabim. Rishus hayachid is the private domain. It belongs to one individual generally, and rishus harabim is the public domain. Now these terms are used loosely here. We're not defining yet what they are, but let's just understand that Rishos HaYachid is what we would call a private domain. Rishos HaRabim is the public domain, an object which is transferred outward. It is taken out from Rishos HaYachid, the private domain, to the public domain. That is the Av Malacha of carrying. Now the Mishnah defines it as follows. The Mishnah says there are 3 steps to the malacha of the carrying. These the original breaking of the resting state of the object. You have an object at rest. When you originally break that state of rest and you put it in motion, that's what we call an akira. Let's call that the akira, the breaking of the resting state of the object. Then it's in motion, it's in transit. When it crosses the border between the 2 domains, the Rishos HaYachid to the Rishos HaRabim, or we'll see vice versa, that is the second step of the hotzah, and then the third step is when it actually comes to rest in the new domain that is in. So again, the 3 stages are akira, making it become from an object at rest to an object in transit. Then there's the actual crossing the border, and then there's going back to being in a state of rest. That's called the hanacha. In order for one to be chayev d'oraisa, in order for one to violate the biblical prohibition of carrying on Shabbos, he has to do all of these 3 actions himself. If he does not do all 3, but he does 1 or 2 of the 3, then he's what's called pater aval asar. He's not violated d'oraisa. He's only done it midrabanan. It's still prohibited rabbinically, but he has not violated the isur d'oraisa. If somebody is an inactive participant, meaning somebody takes it out of his hand, it takes an object out of his hand, or places an object into his hand, so he's a participant, but he's totally inactive, doesn't do anything, then he's not violated anything, and that is permitted. Now, the Av Malacha, which the Mishnah describes for us, is when he transfers it outward from Rishos HaYachid to Rishos HaRabim. The Tolda, subcategory, but also d'oraisa, is when it goes reverse. It goes inward. It goes from the Rishos HaRabim, the public domain, to the Rishos HaYachid. Both of these are d'oraisa. Now, none of this is spelled clearly in the Mishnah. What the Mishnah actually says is it defines for us 8 permutations of how this malacha may happen. And it presents us the following visual. You have a man standing in his own yard. That's Rosh Hashanah. He is the owner of the house. And then you have a poor man standing outside the gate. And an object crosses the gate from the hand of one to the hand of the other. That's the act of carrying that happened. It leaves one Rishus, crosses the border, and goes to rest in the other Rishus. Now, there are three different variables as to how this act might happen. Each variable has two values, and therefore are three variables of two possibilities each takes us to 8 cases all together. What are the three variables? First of all, whose arm crossed the gate? Was it the homeowner on the inside, or was it the poor man on the outside? The second variable is how was it transferred from hand to hand? Was it taken out of an open hand, or was it placed into an open hand? That's the second variable. And the third variable is which direction did the object move? Did it go from Rishus Harabim to Rishus Yachid, or from Rishus Yachid to Rishus Harabim? So here we have 8 cases. The Mishnah refers to them all, and it tells us that the halacha is as follows. It makes no difference if it goes from Rishus Harabim to Rishus Yachid, or from Rishus Yachid to Rishus Harabim. Again, transferring outward from Rishus Yachid to Rishus Harabim is the Av Malacha. Transferring from Rishus Yachid to Rishus Harabim is the Tolda. But either way, it's a Malacha D'Oraisa, so that makes no difference. What does make a difference is not even whose arm crosses the fence. It's if the person whose arm crossed the fence is the one that also transfers the object from hand to hand. Because the person whose arm is crossing the fence is doing the transfer of the object from Rishus to Rishus, and it's doing the final step. If he's also the one who transfers from hand to hand, then he's doing all 3 steps, in which case he is the one who is Chayav D'Oraisa because he did all 3 steps. So, for example, if the poor man picks up the object on his side, so there was the akira, the moving the object from at rest to in transit, then he sticks his hand through the fence, then he's done the second step to transfer across the fence, and then if he places it into the other man's hand, he has now committed the hanacha. He's done all 3 steps. If, however, he doesn't do the transfer from hand to hand, he just holds it, and the other person takes it from his hand, then he's only done 2 out of 3, but the actual moving the object from in transit to at rest was done by the other person. So, the rule is that if the person whose hand crossed the fence also did the transfer from hand to hand, then he's done all 3 steps, and he is chayiv d'oraisa, and the other one is completely innocent, hasn't done a thing. If, however, they shared it, meaning the one whose hand crossed the fence did not actually do the transfer from hand to hand, is the other one who either took it out of his hand or put it into his hand, then there is a sharing of the 3 actions that have to be done. Neither of them did all 3, and they both have a partial commitment, and therefore they both are aser d'Rabbanan, not do what they did, but neither are chayav d'Oraisa. Now, the way the Mishnah expresses these cases is by saying that there are 2 things. There are 2 cases which are really 4 cases, both inside and outside. So that's how we get to 8 cases. The 2 cases which are 4 cases means that there are 2 d'oraisa, where one person's hand committed the entire thing. He crossed the fence and did the transfer from hand to hand. And then there are 2 d'Rabbanan, where he crossed the fence, but he didn't do the transfer from hand to hand. And this all could be if he's the one who's inside the gate and if he's the one who's outside the gate. So the Gemara right away asks that we have this very same type of discussion, which appears in the Gemara Masechah Shuas. The Gemara over there lists off 3 things, which are 2 cases, which are really 4 cases. One of them is this, but it doesn't continue to say that it's both inside and outside. It just says 2 cases which are 4 cases and leaves it at that. It doesn't go a step further to say inside and outside and discuss all 8 cases. Now, let's just first see what the other 2 on the list are before we see the Gemara's answer. The other 2 on the list are swearing falsely. So over there, the Gemara discusses swearing falsely about the future. And the Gemara says there are 2 ways to swear falsely about the future. That is, if you say that you will eat something and you don't end up eating it, or you say that you won't eat it and then you do end up eating it. But that's really 4 cases, because you could also swear falsely about the past in the same 2 ways. But those additional things about the past, those are only d'Rabbanan. The next case on the list is if you eat Kedusha, you eat some holy foods of karbanis, or you step into the Beis HaMikdash, and you forgot that you were tamei when you did that. So over there, those are two cases. Either you ate Kedusha or you went into the Mikdash. In both cases, it had to be that you knew that you were Tameh, and then you forgot, and then you remembered later. And there you have the halacha that you have to bring a carbon oil of a yerig. Those two cases could also be considered four cases, because the fourth case could be if you didn't forget that you were Tameh, but you forgot that the food that you're eating was Kadesh, or that the building you're walking into was the Beis HaMikdash. So that's how two cases could be four cases. And then we had also two cases which could be four cases, as far as Maros Negoyim, what the colors that Negoyim should be. The Torah lists off two colors. They're called Se'es and Beheres, and the Gemara adds similar shades to Se'es and Beheres are also included. Those are also D'oraisa. Now this is different than the other things on the list, in the sense that here all four are D'oraisa. Now, the Gemara is still trying to answer the question of why is it that over here in Masechta Shabbos the Mishnah lists 8 permutations of the case, while in Masechta Shavuos it lists only 4. Now what's obvious is that our Mishnah over here is obviously working with 3 different variables, and the one over there is working with only 2 variables. Each time you add a variable, the number of cases becomes twice as much, because all the existing cases now exist on both sides of the new variable, right? When you have only one variable, so there are 2 cases. If you have a second one, now there are 4, one for each of the 2 that we had before on each side of the current variable. And then when you have 8, that means you're discussing 3 variables. So the answer will obviously be that the Gemara here in Shabbos went into 3 variables, which is 8 cases, because this is Masechta Shabbos, so we go more into detail. The Mishnah in Shavuos only discussed 2 variables, and therefore only has 4 cases. The question is, in Shavuos, which one of the 3 variables we're discussing did it leave out? And the Gemara has 2 attempts to decide which one over here. So the Gemara's first attempt is that over there, in Shavuos, we only discussed where the object is moving from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. It's going outward. And this is what we would call Yitzia, going out. And the language seems to indicate that, because over there it says that there are 4 Yitziyos Shabbos, 4 goings out on Shabbos. So therefore we left out where the object is coming in from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, and the Gemara offers a reasoning for this. When it's going out, it's an Av Malacha, it's the primary category of the Malacha of Hitzah. When it's coming in from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, that is the Tolda. So here, Masechta Shabbos, we discussed Avos and the Toldas. Masechta Shavuos, it left out the Tolda, only discussed the Av. Now the Gemara has a problem with this, because if you're saying that the variable that was left out was when the object moves outward, then the 2 variables we are discussing is whose arm crossed the fence and who transferred the object from hand to hand. That means that half the cases that we have here are only Asur D'Rabbanan, because when it wasn't the same hand that crossed the fence as affected the transfer from hand to hand, so different people did the transfer and different people did the hanacha, so that's not the same person who did everything. You're only going to have an Isser D'Rabbanan there. However, all the 4 cases in Masechta Shavuos should all be D'Oraisa, just like the other lists there. For example, in Negoyim, all the cases there were D'Oraisa, so these should also be D'Oraisa. So the Gemara tries another attempt. The Gemara says, you know what, you're right. We left out all the cases where it's only D'Rabbanan. In Shavuos, we left out the cases where the hand that crossed the fence is not the hand that made the transfer from hand to hand. That way, all the cases that we are discussing are all Asur D'Oraisa. The D'Rabbanans we left out. The Gemara says, but if that's true, that means that we were discussing when the object was coming in from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. Well, that doesn't make sense, because like we said before, it says Yitziyos Shabbos, the goings out of Shabbos, which seems to indicate that we're only talking about where the object went outward from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah. So how does that work? So the Gemara answers, it's not a problem. Really, the term Yitzia refers to moving from one Rishus to another. It doesn't matter which direction. Yitzia means going out of a Rishus into another one, irrespective of whether Rishus Harabim to Rishus Yachid, Rishus Yachid to Rishus Harabim. And the Gemara says, he didn't prove that to you, because later when we list the Malachas of Shabbos, we define Haitzah as going out from Rishus to Rishus. It doesn't matter which direction, therefore they're all called Yitzias. Now, the Gemara says, Ravina says, if you look at our Mishnah, it's also obvious, because our Mishnah also uses the language Yitziyos Shabbos. In the first case it lists is when the poor man had an object in his hand and he crossed the fence with his arm and he gave it to the homeowner. That's a hachnasa. That's leaving Rishus Harabim and going into Rishus Yachid, and we still call it Haitzah. So you see that the term Haitzah could refer to the object moving in any direction, and therefore the Gemara, the Mishnah Shavuos was also discussing that case. The only case that I left out was where it's only D'Rabbanan, where the hand that crossed the fence is not the hand that made the transfer from hand to hand.